Part 4. Soul and Body. 1. When Teresa came home, it was almost 1:30 in the morning. She went into the bathroom, put on her pajamas, and lay down next to Tomasz. He was asleep. She leaned over his face and, kissing it, detected a curious aroma coming from his hair. She took another whiff and yet another. She sniffed him up and down like a dog before realizing what it was: the aroma of a woman's sex organs. At 6, the alarm went off. Kernan's great moment had arrived. He always woke up much earlier than they did, but did not dare to disturb them. He would wait impatiently for the alarm because it gave him the right to jump up on their bed, trample their bodies, and butt them with his muzzle. For a time they had tried to curb him and pushed him off the bed, but he was more headstrong than they were and ended by defending his rights. Lately, Teresa realized she positively enjoyed being welcomed into the day by Keranin. Waking up was sheer delight for him. He always showed a naive and simple amazement at the discovery that he was back on Earth. He was sincerely pleased. She, on the other hand, awoke with great reluctance, with a desire to stave off the day by keeping her eyes closed. Now she was standing in the entrance hall, gazing up at the hat stand where his leash and collar hung ready. She slipped his head through the collar and off they went together to do the shopping. She needed to pick up some milk, butter, and bread, and as usual, his morning roll. Later he trotted back alongside her, roll in mouth, looking proudly from side to side, gratified by the attention he attracted from the passers-by. Once home, he would stretch out with his roll on the threshold of the bedroom and wait for Tomasz to take notice of him, creep up to him, snarl at him, and make believe he was trying to snatch his roll away from him. That was how it went every day. Not until they had chased each other through the flat for at least 5 minutes would Keranin scramble under a table and gobble up the roll. This time, however, he waited in vain for his morning ritual. Tomasz had a small transistor radio on the table in front of him and was listening to it intently. 2. It was a program about the Czech emigration, a montage of private conversations recorded with the latest bugging devices by a Czech spy who had infiltrated the emigre community and then returned in great glory to Prague. It was insignificant prattle dotted with some harsh words about the occupation regime, but here and there one emigre would call another an imbecile or a fraud. These trivial remarks were the point of the broadcast. They were meant to prove not merely that emigres had bad things to say about the Soviet Union, which neither surprised nor upset anyone in the country, but that they call one another names and make free use of dirty words. People use filthy language all day long, but when they turn on the radio and hear a well-known personality, someone they respect, saying fuck in every sentence, they feel somehow let down. It all started with Prokaska, said Tomasz. Jan Prokaska, a 40-year-old Czech novelist with the strength and vitality of an ox, began criticizing public affairs vociferously even before 1968. He then became one of the best-loved figures of the Prague Spring, that dizzying liberalization of communism which ended with the Russian invasion. Shortly after the invasion, the press initiated a smear campaign against him, but the more they smeared, the more people liked him. Then in 1970, to be exact, the Czech radio broadcast a series of private talks between Prokaska and a professor friend of his, which had taken place 2 years before, that is, in the spring of 1968. For a long time, neither of them had any idea that the professor's flat was bugged and their every step dogged. Prokaska loved to regale his friends with hyperbole and excess. Now his excesses had become a weekly radio series. The secret police who produced and directed the show took pains to emphasize the sequences in which Prokaska made fun of his friends. Dubček, for instance. People slander their friends at the drop of a hat, but they were more shocked by the much-loved Prokaska than by the much-hated secret police. Tomasz turned off the radio and said, "Every country has its secret police, but a secret police that broadcasts its tape over the radio. There's something that could only happen in Prague, something absolutely without precedent." "I know a precedent," said Teresa. "When I was 14, I kept a secret diary. I was terrified that someone might read it, so I kept it hidden in the attic. Mother sniffed it out. One day at dinner, while we were all hunched over our soup, she took it out of her pocket and said, 'Listen carefully now, everybody.' And after every sentence, she burst out laughing. They all laughed so hard they couldn't eat." 3. He always tried to get her to stay in bed and let him have breakfast alone. She never gave in. Tomasz was at work from 7 to 4, Teresa from 4 to midnight. If she were to miss breakfast with him, the only time they could actually talk together was on Sundays. That was why she got up when he did and then went back to bed. This morning, however, she was afraid of going back to sleep because at 10 she was due at the sauna on Zofien Island. The sauna, though, coveted by the many, could accommodate only the few, and the only way to get in was by pull. Luckily, the cashier was the wife of a professor removed from the university after 1968, and the professor a friend of a former patient of Tomasz's. Tomasz told the patient told the professor told his wife, and Teresa had a ticket waiting for her once a week. She walked there. She detested the trams constantly packed with people pushing into one another's hate-filled embraces, stepping on one another's feet, tearing off one another's coat buttons, and shouting insults. It was drizzling. As people rushed along, they began opening umbrellas over their heads, and all at once the streets were crowded too. Arched umbrella roofs collided with one another. The men were courteous, and when passing Teresa, they held their umbrellas high over their heads and gave her room to go by. But the women would not yield. Each looked straight ahead, waiting for the other woman to acknowledge her inferiority and step aside. The meeting of the umbrellas was a test of strength. At first, Teresa gave way, but when she realized her courtesy was not being reciprocated, she started clutching her umbrella like the other women and ramming it forcefully against the oncoming umbrellas. No one ever said, "Sorry." For the most part, no one ever said anything, though once or twice she did hear, "A fat cow," or "Fuck you." The women thus armed with umbrellas were both young and old, but the younger among them proved the more steeled warriors. Teresa recalled the days of the invasion and the girls in miniskirts carrying flags on long staffs. Theirs was a sexual vengeance. The Russian soldiers had been kept in enforced celibacy for several long years and must have felt they had landed on a planet invented by a science fiction writer, a planet of stunning women who paraded their scorn on beautiful long legs like the likes of which had not been seen in Russia for the past 5 or 6 centuries. She had taken many pictures of those young women against the backdrop of tanks. How she had admired them! And now these same women were bumping into her meanly and spitefully. Instead of flags, they held umbrellas, but they held them with the same pride. They were ready to fight as obstinately against a foreign army as against an umbrella that refused to move out of their way. "4. She came out into the old town square, the stern spires of Ten Church, the irregular rectangular of Gothic and Baroque houses. Old Town Hall, which dated from the 14th century, had once stretched over a whole side of the square, was in ruins and had been so for 27 years. Warsaw, Dresden, Berlin, Cologne, Budapest, all were horribly scarred in the last war. But their inhabitants had built them up again and painstakingly restored the old historical sections. The people of Prague had an inferiority complex with respect to those other cities. Old Town Hall was the only monument of note destroyed in the war, and they decided to leave it in ruins so that no Pole or German could accuse them of having suffered less than their share. In front of the glorious ruins, a reminder for now and eternity of the evils penetrated by war, stood a steel bar reviewing stand for some demonstration or other that the Communist Party had herded the people of Prague to the day before, or would be herding them to the day after. Gazing at the remains of the old town hall, Teresa was suddenly reminded of her mother. That perverse need one has to expose one's ruins, one's ugliness, to parade one's misery, to uncover the stump of one's amputated arm and force the whole world to look at it. Everything had begun reminding her of her mother lately. Her mother's world, which she had fled 10 years before, seemed to be coming back to her, surrounding her on all sides. That was why she told Tomasz that morning about how her mother had read her secret diary at the dinner table to an accompaniment of guffaws. When a private talk over a bottle of wine is broadcast on the radio, what can it mean but that the world is turning into a concentration camp? Almost from childhood, Teresa had used the term to express how she felt about life with her family. A concentration camp is a world in which people live crammed together constantly, night and day. Brutality and violence are merely secondary, and not in the least indispensable characteristics. A concentration camp is the complete obliteration of privacy. Prokaska, who was not allowed to chat with a friend over a bottle of wine in the shelter of privacy, lived, unknown to him, a fatal error on his part, in a concentration camp. Teresa lived in the concentration camp when she lived with her mother. Almost from childhood, she knew that a concentration camp was nothing exceptional or startling, but something very basic, a given into which we are born and from which we can escape only with the greatest of efforts. Five. The women sitting on the 3 terraced benches were packed in so tightly that they could not help touching. Sweating away next to Teresa was a woman of about 30 with a very pretty face. She had 2 unbelievably large, pendulous breasts hanging from her shoulders, bouncing at the slightest movement. When the woman got up, Teresa saw that her behind was like 2 enormous sacks, and that it had nothing in common with her fine face. Perhaps the woman stood frequently in front of the mirror, observing her body, trying to peer through it into her soul, as Teresa had done since childhood. Surely she too had harbored the blissful hope of using her body as a poster for her soul. But what a monstrous soul it would have to be if it reflected that body, that rack for 4 pouches. Teresa got up and rinsed herself off under the shower. Then she went out into the open. It was still drizzling. Standing just above the Vltava on a slatted deck and sheltered from the eyes of the city by a few square feet of tall wooden panel, she looked down to see the head of the woman she had just been thinking about. It was bobbing on the surface of the rushing river. The woman smiled up at her. She had a delicate nose, large brown eyes, and a childish glance. As she climbed the ladder, her tender features gave way to two sets of quivering pouches, spraying tiny drops of cold water right and left. Six. Teresa went in to get dressed and stood in front of the large mirror. No, there was nothing monstrous about her body. She had no pouches hanging from her shoulders. In fact, her breasts were quite small. Her mother used to ridicule her for having such small breasts, and she had had a complex about them until Tomasz came along. But reconciled to their size as she was still mortified by the very large, very dark circles around her nipples. Had she been able to design her own body, she would have chosen inconspicuous nipples, the kind that scarcely protrude from the arch of the breast and all but blend in color with the rest of the skin. She thought of her areolae as big crimson targets painted by a primitivist of pornography for the poor. Looking at herself, she wondered what she would be like if her nose grew a millimeter a day. How long would it take before her face began to look like someone else's? And if various parts of her body began to grow and shrink and Teresa no longer looked like herself, would she still be herself? Would she still be Teresa? Of course. Even if Teresa were completely unlike Teresa, her soul inside her would be the same and look in amazement at what was happening to her body. Then, what was the relationship between Teresa and her body? Had her body the right to call itself Teresa? And if not, then what did the name refer to? Merely something incorporeal, intangible? These are questions that had been going through Teresa's head since she was a child. Indeed, the only true serious questions are the ones that even a child can formulate. Only the most naive of questions are truly serious. They are the questions with no answers. A question with no answer is a barrier that cannot be breached. In other words, it is questions with no answers that set the limits of human possibilities, describe the boundaries of human existence. Teresa stood bewitched before the mirror, staring at her body as if it were alien to her, alien and yet assigned to her and no one else. She felt disgusted by it. It lacked the power to become the only body in Tomasz's life. It had disappointed and deceived her. All that night she had had to inhale the aroma of another woman's groin from his hair. Suddenly she longed to dismiss her body as one dismisses a servant, to stay on with Tomasz only as a soul and send her body into the world to behave as other female bodies behave with male bodies. If her body had failed to become the only body for Tomasz, and thereby lost her the biggest battle of her life, it could just as well go off on its own.